Hello everybody, my name is Spoons Rattling, and as a sequel to the video that I accidentally uploaded at midnight, we are going to now do the same thing, but for the Age of Sigmar factions. Now, Age of Sigmar is a relatively young game system. I suppose it's been around for some time now, but still it's not as storied as 40k or Fantasy Battle was, or something like Necromunda even. But still, I recently got into Sigmar, and in general I quite enjoy it. I find that they have great models, unsurprisingly. And I find the lore that I've read to be quite enjoyable too, even though I think there are some things that are honestly let down by their models rather than their lore. Let's get into it. So first up we have oh man, I'm hardly a Sigmar fan, am I? I can't remember the name of these guys. It's a Khorne faction, but their name is complete, Blades of Khorne? Yes, Blades of Khorne. So, I can't believe I forgot a name as simple as that. It's Khorne's favorite thing and Khorne's own name. Blades of Khorne are a Khornate faction. They use a lot of mortal models, and in general they look really cool, and that's a large part of what makes a faction good, in my opinion. Even though I've never been super into collecting sort of mono-god chaos factions, mainly just because they're some newfangled thing to me, at least. But in general, I think the Blades of Khorne are pretty cool. Compared to something like the Maggotkin of Nurgle, they tend to slant more towards mortals, which I like, and their mortal models look sick. I mean, there's a reason why before World Eaters got their update, pretty much everyone converted their berserkers out of these guys, because they look really cool. There's really not much more to it. They've got really cool models, they've got cool weapons, Khorne stuff generally looks pretty sick. Granted, I'm not super familiar with their fluff or anything, but I am still just basically off the coolness of their models, which, goes a long way for a lot of these. I believe these guys go to B tier. Next up, we have the Cities of Sigmar. Now, Cities of Sigmar fill in the standard guys, right, of a fantasy setting. They use a lot of old world models still, like the Ironbreaker dwarves with their hammers, and those guys with the purple robes and the masks. Though Cities isn't a faction that I'm terribly interested in, I don't think it's a bad faction by any means. And to be honest, they're sort of a forgettable faction in my opinion. Which there's a couple others, but overall, I'm not the biggest fan of the Cities of Sigmar. I think it's just they have a slightly, I'm not sure if cartoony is the right word, but a slightly more almost silly a slant to their armor, right? I think their standard steel helms look pretty solid, but like their High Marshal, I'm not a fan of his helmet. It's just sort of doesn't really appeal to my sensibilities. They also don't really have any big bulky units, which I really enjoy, so that does knock them. But their models are solid, but I'm not the biggest fan of them. I think that puts them sort of in C tier, where I don't hate them or anything, but they certainly aren't a terribly interesting faction, in my opinion. This is the Daughters of Khaine, who are the sort of crazy elves, if you will. They've got some interesting models. They have them half-serpent people. I guess elf would be the proper term there. But these gals, I believe they're all female. I don't think it's like the Drukhari, where witches can be male. But here, yeah, I'm pretty sure all of them are, female elves. And their models, to me, are kind of bland, except for, like, the characters. That's sort of my opinion on it. Like their normal infantry are they're very similar to witches, unsurprisingly, though I think they look better just because they're a little newer. But there really isn't too much going on here that interests me outside of like the snake people, because snake people are cool and I quite like them. And they got that new crow-winged person, which this is going to be a little bit of a weird side tangent, but I enjoyed that. What's her name? The Crone Seer. I appreciated them having a elf with like a full head of hair for once. A lot of the elves, especially in 40k, tend to be like bald, or they have top knots or very weird haircuts. And I am someone who really appreciates big hairstyles, so that was a cool model in my opinion. But they sort of fall into a similar thing to the Cities of Sigmar, where they're a cool faction. I like their snake aesthetic going on. But they're not my favorite faction by far. Now we have the, it's not that the Hedonites are the Slaanesh one. These guys are the Disciples of Tzeentch. Now, Disciples of Tzeentch feature Zangors, and if you remember in my Combat Patrol tier list, I don't like Zangors. I think they look rather dumb. But I will say the things that aren't Zangors in this faction are pretty solid, as rare as they may be. Not the changeling, the curseling, like the curseling model, that's sick. I love the Tzeentch style of armor. The Rubric Marines have a similar thing going on. And in general, I like the shiny blue things that they have going on. They have a lot of really cool models. Like that's just kind of the long and the short of it. They don't have too many. Unsurprisingly, they're very similar to the Thousand Sons. But their few unique models are really good. The Curseling's one of my favorite models. I love that model so much. The armor's just so cool. And for being cool, I'm going to put them alongside the Blades of Khorne. Though the Blades of Khorne have a more fleshed out model range, which definitely gives them the edge. And they don't have Zangors. I've made my opinion on Zangors very apparent. I do not like the goat bird people. Next up, we have Slaves to Darkness. Now, Slaves to Darkness are effectively just fantasy warriors of chaos transplanted into Age of Sigmar, and their model refresh was so good. There's not a whole lot going on in terms of lore, though I do quite like the sort of rivalry between Be'lakor and Archaon. The main reason that I like the Slaves to Darkness so much is they're just like the archetypical evil knight aesthetic, and an entire army of that. It's cool. And they look sick. Their basic infantry have capes. That's like the coolest thing a model can have is a cape. And they're all wearing big, heavy armor. And if you know me, you know I like big, heavy armor. And all of their models look good, except for like the Chaos Lord on Manticore, because that's a fantasy model that still is around from, I believe, 2010 at the latest. Overall, fantastic faction. Just looks really sick, and that is going to be real. The main thing that appeals to a faction standing is how cool do their models look, how well do they fit in the setting, and a bunch of evil knights with capes charging into battle with swords and shields is sick and fits the setting very well. Next we have the Flesh Eater Courts. The Flesh Eater Courts are a very unique faction in my opinion, and they're one of those factions almost like Sisters, where I can acknowledge how cool their lore and fluff is, but they're not a faction I would ever collect. Now, that is not a knock against their models, because I will say they have very cool models that are very unique and, as I mentioned, sick-looking. And their fluff is really cool, too. They have... they're these horrific, almost, classical vampire werewolf aesthetics going on. But they think that, they're blinded by an illusion that they think they're these regal knights and proud warriors fighting back evil, which is a really cool concept, honestly. I really, really like that. And, I mean, their last model wave went over really well. Usharan, for example, was just such a great character model. That whole model is fantastic. But yeah, they're a great faction. I love their design. And out of all the death factions, they're probably my favorite. And for that, I'm going to put them up in B tier, which is a little higher than I put the Sisters. Or no, this is the same tier I put the Sisters in for the 40k equivalent of this. Next up, we have the Fyreslayers, who are a dwarf sub-faction, but they don't have a whole lot going on model-wise, outside of the Magmadroth, which I will admit, Magmadroth is a very cool model. Big dragon with a dwarf with a big weapon on its back. It's hard to go wrong with that. But the rest of them are just kind of the same variation of shirtless dwarves with axes. Now, that is a very cool aesthetic, but I would like some variation. You know what I mean? Just something a little different, just to add some extra flavor to the faction. And that's really the main thing they're crazy dwarves, right? They're very aggressive, and they like to fight with big hammers and axes, so that does give them something. But their model range is a little lacking, which is sort of the opposite of these two, where I like the models they have, there's just not a lot of variety, where I'm sort of lukewarm on the models these guys have. Except for a couple, like the Snake People, and I quite like that, the Ogre with the guy on his back. I quite like that for the cities of Sigmar. Next up, we have the Moonspite Gitz? No, Gloomspite, I believe it is, if I'm not mistaken, which I very well could be. Gloomspite. Gloomspite Gitz are cool. They are Gretchen, and if you've met someone and they don't like Gretchen, they aren't real. Those people are not real. Gretchen are really funny, and they're cool. And these guys get to use a lot of squigs and giant spiders, which is also really cool aesthetic, because squigs are hilarious, and I love them, and I wish I could run units of squigs in 40k outside of Squig Hog Boys. And they also got the Troggoths, which are very classical, like, ogre like designs, really. They in a sense remind me of the ogres from Oblivion, if any of you have played that, which I presume some of you have. But the Troggoths also, they add in weirdly enough, they're an army of really scrawny little grots, but since they have those Troggoths, they have things that appeal to me. Big, bulky units of elite infantry, if you will. And of course, giant spiders are innately cool. I really like the Gloomspite Gitz, and of course they are always high on mushrooms, which is great. Gloomspite Gitz, great. They're going up in B tier, right around the same tier as all these other guys that I really like, but I may not collect necessarily. Next up we have Hedonites. Now Hedonites are god-specific, so they're not necessarily my favorite thing, but I will admit the Hedonites of Slaanesh have some fantastic models. The one that comes to mind is, what's his name? Sigmund? Sigvald. The guy, Sigvald. Big demon prince with the mirror shield and sword. And I really like that because I like when they sort of dip into the variety of demon infusion that you see. Because Sigvald is just a really tall, normal guy, though he's obviously a demon prince. He's imbued with that crazy power. And I really like their the Painbringers. They're armored guys with the swords and shields. And as far as god-specific factions go, this is probably one of the ones I would collect. And also, they have some cool cavalry that are mounted on Seekers, which makes me just want to see the Slaanesh demons get an update, because, dear God, the Slaanesh demons are the ugliest out of all of them. Which is ironic, in a sense, which I suppose could be what they're going for. But Hedonites I really enjoy. And I mean, and obviously, like, they look cool, they've got armor, and they've got great models. And for that, they might be a faction I would one day collect, so I am going to put them in A tier. And mainly, I think part of it is because back in the day, when the 2010 Demon Prince was still around, I was thinking, how do I want to make a Demon Prince? Because that model was awful. I hated that model. And I was like, well, Sigvald's on the same base, and, with a bit of trimming and changing, he would fit perfectly. So Sigvald holds a very prominent place in my mind, and he's a great model. So there we go. Next up, we have the Idoneth Deepkin, right? The fish elves, which is another really unique faction. I will say, Sigmar does really well on having its factions have their own unique feel. And of course, these guys do have the crab, which was such a great model reveal a few years back. And as someone who really enjoys the sea, I'm quite an avid learner of the creatures and fauna and flora that populate the sea. You'd think these guys would be right up my alley, but they sort of aren't, weirdly enough. They sort of fall into that I like their models, but I probably wouldn't collect them sort of tier, right? They just don't... They don't do a lot for me. I like their models. They're all very high quality. I like the octopus guy quite a lot. But overall, there's just not a lot here that interests me. I think it's sort of that issue of they don't have a big, bulky infantry unit, and my favorite thing to run in a faction is a big, elite, bulky infantry unit, or cavalry where applicable. And these guys just don't really do it for me. And also, no giant octopus monster, so when are we getting that? Though I will still give them a B tier, because their models are really good, and I really like them, but they're just not something I would collect. Now we have the, oh god, what are they called? No. I was reading these guys' rules the other day. It's the Kharadron Overlords. That's right, I was talking about this at the game store yesterday. And the Kharadron Overlords are a faction you think I would really, really like. And model-wise, they are. I love the Kharadron Overlords. But the thing that holds them back for me is their archetypal playstyle. They just play in a very strange way, which really holds me back from being interested in them, which is... I know this is odd for me to say, because I'm the guy who is usually saying, buy units you like, because that's the simple fact of the matter. If you don't like your army, you're never going to finish it, and you're not going to enjoy playing with it. But if you love your army, it doesn't really matter if you win or lose at that point. But these guys, even last edition of Sigmar, which I was still vaguely interested in, their playstyle just doesn't really appeal to me. It's very strange, very transport-heavy with their flying ships, but that's the thing, their models look cool. But even though these guys would be like a faction right up my army. Heavily armored dwarves with guns? Yeah, that's sick. That's so sick. But honestly, their shooting isn't terribly interesting, which Sigmar as a whole is a more melee-focused game. But still, you think the dwarves with big steam cannons would shoot a little better than they do. Yeah, it's just a shame. It doesn't quite come together for me. Their playstyle is just not something I particularly find interesting, though I will still give them B tier because a bunch of banker dwarves wearing space armor that travel in the upper atmosphere, yeah, that's sick as hell. Like, I'm not going to deny that that's not sick. Next up, Lumineth Realm-lords. So these guys are, I believe, the last elf faction we have, if I'm not mistaken. The Lumineth are pretty cool. Pretty standard elf sort of aesthetic. Not too far removed from like Peter Jackson elves in the Lord of the Rings trilogy, though a slightly more animal motif and a few more plumes. But they still fill in that very Lord of the Rings feeling with their elven warriors. And it does have one of my favorite models that GW makes, the Light of Eltharion, who is this like ghost armor and all its parts are floating off of each other, and it overall just looks so cool. And I definitely want to get this guy. I'm not sure what I'd use him for, because Lumineth don't quite have the same appeal to me as something like the Eldar do in 40k. Though they're probably, overall, in my opinion, not the most interesting. They're elves, and they do elvish things, and their armor does look pretty cool. I'm not sure if I would go with the white and blue color scheme, personally. And the giant cow thing is pretty cool, I will not deny. But overall, they don't quite have the same flavor and pull as the Eldar do. Next up, we have Maggotkin of Nurgle. So Maggotkin of Nurgle are not too far removed from their other god legion counterparts, or faction, I should say. But I will say, as someone who decried the Death Guard last video, they were my least favorite faction in all of 40k, the Maggotkin of Nurgle are a lot cooler. I'm not sure how they pulled it off, because usually the Nurgle aesthetic just really isn't my thing. But like the Putrid Blight Kings, in my opinion, are just way cooler than like Plague Marines are. I'm not sure if it has something to do with the fact that these guys, realistic isn't the right term, but they don't lead quite into the silliness of Nurgle quite as much. They don't really have like the stomach mouths. They tend to just have like gaping, oozing wounds there. They tend to wear these very plain armor with just the slits for vision, and they wield these big corroded weapons. I really like the Putrid Blight Kings. If you couldn't tell, I really enjoy those models. I mean, the Glotkin is such a great model as well. I think the reason I like these guys more than Death Guard model-wise is they lead more into like the ominous side of Nurgle rather than the silliness, which there's a place for that, and I think the Nurgle demons do that really well, the Nurglings and the Great Unclean One. These guys, as the mortal followers, though, I like that they don't really have like, they're not smiling, they don't have, their helmets cover their face, and they just tend to look like these ominous walls of rotted flesh covered in these fetid wounds, right? That are just, spilling out. They've got Nurglings running around inside them. And they don't have things like, they don't have a guy wearing like fly armor, like that one, I believe it's Terminator, from the Death Guard. And that's what really separates from them. These guys have some of that silliness, Festus, for example, or, of course, they run the Nurgle demons. The Great Unclean One is sort of, he has that silliness to him, right? That I like that about Nurgle, but these guys get the balance right. They have that with, as I mentioned, the Great Unclean One and the Nurglings, but then you look at the actual Putrid Blight Kings, and they are just like these faceless abominations that are huge and have these giant rusted weapons. Now, also, Harbinger of Decay, one of the sickest models ever. However, they are a Nurgle faction, and you know what that means. Despite the fact that the Putrid Blight Kings are these massive, muscled monsters with these huge cleaver weapons, they hit like wet noodles, because thus is the way of Nurgle, I suppose. Your army has to be boring to play, does no damage, and is really hard to kill, which I get it. Nurgle's supposed to be hard to kill, but if you're gonna make the Putrid Blight Kings look this intimidating in melee, make them actually hit hard in melee. That's what holds them back for me. It's a Nurgle faction. Despite the fact that it's a Nurgle faction that I love the models in, I love them, they're so good. They do not have a fun playstyle because they are a Nurgle faction, which is really, really annoying. Regardless, that's been my overly long tangent about why the Maggotkin of Nurgle are better than Death Guard by so many degrees, and their model range is so much cooler, but I still won't collect them, and that puts them at the top of B tier. Just because they're a Nurgle faction, and they're so, like, they just can't make a Nurgle unit have good damage. Like, I would be fine if they weren't quite as tough, but they had a lot of damage because they look like they would mess things up in close combat. Regardless, I'm ranting. And next up in Death, we have Nighthaunt, yeah? So Nighthaunt are definitely a very popular faction, obviously. These guys were the sort of main villains, if you will, well, 2 editions ago now that I think about it, so they're probably not quite as popular. But these guys are pretty interesting aesthetic-wise. They're very archetypal, sort of like, not kitty ghosts, like Halloween ghosts, but they're very standard ghosts, and they have those metal faceplates or the skulls. And their model range is pretty cool. They do kind of have that problem. They don't really have anything that really appeals to me, personally. But their models are all really cool. I can't deny it. The guy riding the skeleton Pegasus, if you will, and the carriage, I think, is really sick with all the ghost horses. And on the tabletop, they look really cool. There's a guy at my local game store who plays them, and yeah, when they're all like ranked up, they look really cool. Though they do, yeah. I mean, it's not surprising. They're ghosts. I can't expect them to have, ghost Terminators, even though that would be sick. These guys, again, they fall into B tier. Just because they're a cool faction with models that I like, but they're not one I would collect. Not necessarily rules-wise, but again, they just don't have any units that speak to me on a personal level. And that's the biggest thing of collecting an army, is does the army speak to you, right? Does it appeal to your sensibilities of combat, of the game, of the setting? And these guys fit into the setting really well, and they have some really cool models. The Mirrormorn Banshees come to mind. They're pretty cool. I like Sigmar has a lot more of these than 40k does, where they have these hollow models to represent ghosts or possessed suits of armor, which would be cool to see something like Thousand Suns get something like that. Next up, we have the Ogre Wartribes. Yeah, Ogre Mawtribes. Sorry, I shouldn't mess that up. They will kill me. So, the ogres are, if I'm not mistaken, mostly made up from their old world counterparts, and they're a pretty elite army. They're pretty big and brawlic, though they do have some really sick models. I really like their big mammoth thing, the Thunder Tusks, Stone Horns. Those things are sick. I mean, I love paleontology, so these things are basically just mammoths, and obviously I quite like that. Though they are still using some ancient models like the Icefall Yetis, which I have in a book from 2004 at them being shown off. So evidently they've been around for a while. Overall, the ogres they're pretty solid. I like their general aesthetic for the most part. I tend to like their slightly older models more. Like the Bloodpelt Hunter is a more modern model, and I don't quite enjoy that as much. But then there's things like the Slaughtermaster, and of course they have the pirate guy who is missing a pirate hat. However, very cool model. And overall, they're a fine faction. They're just sort of similar to some of the other ones. They don't really appeal to me aesthetic-wise. Like if I feel like I'm gonna go with like barely armored, big brawlic guys, I'll just go with orcs. Though they have good models, so I'll give them B tier. Next up, we have the Orruk Warclans. Speak of the devil, and he shall appear. So the Orruks in Age of Sigmar are sort of split into a couple different sub-factions, if you will. There's the cool ones, and that's the Iron Jaws, and then you have the sneaky ones, which are the Cruel Boys, which the Cruel Boys aren't a faction that I would particularly collect, mainly because I like the archetypal orcs more, but I do like that they're playing with that dichotomy between Gork and Mork a little more here than they do in 40k, which I understand. Though the Cruel Boys have some great models. That big vulture's cool. However, Iron Jaws are a faction I am very interested in collecting. Iron Jaws are really cool. I love orcs in armor, and these are big orcs in armor with big crude weapons. The Rekkas, I think, are really cool. The ones that get their skull drilled in to release all that psychic evilness. And of course, they got the giant boar last edition, and the giant boar is sick because it's a giant boar with 3 orcs on it. And they got the guy with the funny anvil squig. These guys are an easy S tier, mainly just off the strength of the Iron Jaws. I love the Iron Jaws so much, and I hope to see some of that in 40k. Even though orcs got their big refresh not too long ago, I still would love to see more. I love orcs. They're too cool. And orcs in big armor with swords and with spears and shields, sign me up. Next up, we have a faction that I'm very not a fan of. So we have the Ossiarch Bonereapers. Now, these guys are strange, because they're a skeleton faction, but in, again, a more unique take, they aren't skeletons in the way that, like, the not Flesh Eater courts, what are they? The vampires. We'll get to them eventually. The Ossiarch Bonereapers are a skeleton faction, but they're almost like an elite skeleton faction, which you don't really see in a lot of fantasy settings, which I give them points for being unique at the very least. And they have some great models. Mainly they're monsters. The big sort of skeleton with the mace hands, quite like that. The Morghasts, obviously, they're very cool. They're these giant skeleton warriors with wings. But then when we get to like their standard infantry, I'm not the biggest fan, and I can't exactly place why. I don't know. It's just something about them doesn't quite do it for me. I think it's because they're skeletons, but you know, when I think skeleton, I think spindly. But these guys are like not. They're very brawlic. They're basically in bone armor. And I'm not the most familiar with their lore, but they're just not like. It's weird. They're monsters, they're elite infantry, I like all of that, but I don't like their standard infantry. And that kind of kills the whole faction for me, because you know, you're going to want to have some of those in there. Well, I'm sure I could do a monster mash list of just the Morghasts and the Gothazard. I don't know, it just doesn't do it for me. It doesn't quite come together in a faction that I'm not particularly a big fan of, which is a shame, because as I mentioned, the Gothazard, the Morghasts, even the Necropolis Stalkers, I think those models are all really cool. But yeah, just they don't quite come together. It's a shame. It really is. I think, honestly, I would have gone for a more Tyranid route for these guys, where they have those elite units like monsters or warriors, and then you have your scrawny guys, because that's always a cool look, right? You have your scrawny guys, and then you got the big monster behind them. Overall, they're not a faction I particularly like. In fact, in all of Sigmar, they're probably my least favorite. And they take the bottom spot, at least at this point. Next up, we have the Peak. I have to say, the Peak. Seraphon are sick. As I mentioned earlier, I love paleontology, and while these guys are not at all accurate to real dinosaurs, they are sick, and I can admit that. They've got psychic frog people, big brawlic lizards with swords and shields, or clubs and shields, I suppose. They've got a fire-breathing Arizonosaurus, which is also sick. And then you have, like, big, huge lizards riding velociraptors. Not velociraptors, Utah raptors. But even still, like, it's just a sick aesthetic. And also, they're lizards from space with teleportation technology, and they ride giant triceratops with sun weapons on the back. Like, these guys are sick. And they've got a cool big, Ankylosaurus kind of a deal with the Bastillodon. And overall, they're just like, they are the peak. They are peak. They are so cool. Easily the best Order faction, bar none. These guys are cool. If someone doesn't like the Seraphon, you can't trust them. They're bad people. That's a fact. You can take me to court over this. Seraphon, sick as hell. I'm going to put them above the Orruks, because the Orruks have the Cruel Boys, and I'm not the biggest Cruel Boy fan. Next up, we have the Skaven. Skaven are sick. I will not deny that. Skaven, though, sort of fall into that. I love their faction and their lore and their aesthetics, but I'm not sure if I would ever collect them. They have a similar archetype to the Tyranids in 40k, where you have the whole spectrum. You've got clan rats, which are your normal guys. You've got, storm vermin are the more armored ones. And then you have these crazy abominations, which are so cool, and would fit right in 40k, might I add. You have things, the Hell Pit Abomination, the Brood Terror. Then you have things like the Rat Ogres, which just look sick. Then you have the giant Warp Stone death beams and rattling guns, which, pun aside, is also just a sick weapon. It's this big wheel-mounted thing with 10 barrels, and it's just spewing out inaccurately, spewing out shards of warpstone. And as I mentioned, rat ogres look really, really sick. And what are the ones? Not rat ogres. There's another one that I'm trying to think of. What are they called? The Storm Fiends. Storm Fiends, like rat ogres, but in bigger armor, and they have Gatling gun arms, which again, very sick. As I mentioned, the Doom, things like the Doom Wheel. You have those little spinny circle things that remind me of like General Grievous's bike, his wheel bike from Episode 3 of Star Wars. And then you have, of course, the heavy weapon batteries. And the more I talk about it, the more I realize I really like the Skaven. But I would definitely run a Monster Mash sort of Skaven list. I would not be running really any clan rats, really. I'd be running rat ogres, big warp lightning cannons. And I don't know how effective that is or how powerful that would be, but it's a sick collection. And giant hordes of insane rats that have nuclear bombs, yeah, of course it's sick. Again, these guys, they're on my radar, at the very least. For just having sick stuff that appeals to my sensibilities, and also their models are all great. I mean, you wouldn't expect rat people to come together as good as the Skaven really do. And a lot of that is due to their range refresh, of course, that they just got. But, I mean, I'm not going to hold that against them. They've got so much cool stuff. They've got, like, those Grenadiers, which I really like, and, of course, the Doom Flayers and the Doom Wheel, and Skaven, very sick. I love Skaven. Skaven are going to A tier alongside the Hedonites. So next up we have the Giants. Gargants, rather. Sorry, I shouldn't call them that. So Gargants, or Sons of Behemat, I suppose, are the Sigmar equivalent of Knights, funnily enough. They're these huge models, lots of wounds, pretty dang tough. You only need a few of them. One of them makes up a quarter of your army. And they're made from the same kit. That's the main thing with them. That is another big similarity between them and Knights is you buy a Gargant box and you can build several variants of the Gargants. But am I like a huge Gargant fan? No, I'm not. Not particularly. I think the thing with Gargants is almost in a similar vein to Knights. Is I think Gargants work better as like an auxiliary unit in like a Chaos army, where you could have this big stomping thing, backing up your army of regular guys. And I think that when it's just a whole army of Gargants, they kind of lose their luster. You know what I'm saying? So these guys are they're going to end up in C tier. Their models are nice, but they're not really for me. Again, I think they work really good as an accent piece to an army rather than a centerpiece. Like if I was looking at rewind 15 years, if I was looking at like a white dwarf, I would expect to see an army of Chaos Warriors with a giant walking behind them. That's where I see these guys being at their best. Next up, we have, what are these guys called? Soulblight Gravelords. These were these are vampires and with some hints of werewolves there, and skeletons. Yeah, these guys have some cool models. I'm not the biggest fan. I like the zombie dragon, of course. Zombie dragon is very cool, and that whole family of kits, really. I mean, they have some very impressive models. I won't deny. I think the Blood Knights are all right, but I don't know. To me, these guys always get forgotten behind how cool Flesh Eater Courts are, which I believe puts them probably into C tier. There's just not a lot here that's because you have your vampires and skeletons, or you could go for insane vampire and skeleton sort of beasts that think that they're these insanely noble things that are protecting their kingdom and expanding their influence, or you just have regular vampires and skeletons. So that they just sort of get lost in the mix, right? And their models are only okay. I'm probably going to put them here. The Stormcast Eternals, as many call them Sigmarines. And Stormcast Eternals are... I'm not going to say they aren't. They very evidently fill the same role the Space Marines do. But Stormcast Eternals are... if you can get over that hurdle of them being just, fantasy Space Marines, there's a lot to like about the Stormcast Eternals. Their lore is really cool, right? They're a company of heroes, each of them taken in their moment of death when they were being heroic, taken by Sigmar, reforged into lightning beings in golden armor, or whatever armor for their particular host, and they descend upon bolts of lightning into the fight, and they fight as few but powerful. Again, more connections to the Space Marines. And honestly, I think the thing is GW is just not helping themselves with the comparisons to Space Marines, specifically with things like Lord Relictors. Stormcasts share some similarities. They've got the big shoulder pads, they're evidently big armored guys, but you're not helping yourself by producing a unit that wears mainly black with a skull helmet and comparing them to the Space Marines, which just overshadows how cool Stormcast Eternals really are. Because they are. They are really, really cool. But they're just held back by sort of their status as the starter army, right? They have, lots of cool dudes with shields. They've got cool, big guys with huge wings. They're overall a really sick faction, but they're often, surprisingly enough, just overlooked because people just think, oh, these are just fantasy Space Marines. But there's a lot there to like, I'm going to be honest. In a lot of ways, they're really, really cool, and they could stand on their own. If Stormcast Eternals were in some other IP or other company, the Stormcast would be like, oh my god, these are the sickest things ever. But since they came with Age of Sigmar, which was the end of Fantasy Battle, which was a rocky time, just because the state Fantasy Battle was in wasn't great, and the transition to Age of Sigmar wasn't particularly graceful either. But I think even though they've had some, they're a sick faction, but they'll just never escape the shadow of the Space Marines, which is just such a shame, because the Stormcasts really are just really, really cool. And their models are great. They are. I'm not the biggest fan of the new Thunderstrike armor. I liked the robes of the first-gen Stormcasts quite a lot. But, I mean, then you have things like Annihilators, and overall, they've got a great model line. And I hope over time they can shed that idea that these are just discount Space Marines. Because in their lore, they've got a lot of cool stuff. They're a really cool faction on the whole. And they are the poster boys. And while they aren't my favorite, I am still going to put them in S, because when you think Age of Sigmar, what do you think of? Stormcast Eternals. That's just the simple fact of the matter. Next up, we have Sylvaneth, the Tree People. Now, the Sylvaneth are really cool. They have a lot of really cool they're like Ents taken to their most logical conclusion, right? Instead of just being walking trees, they're like spirits that possess wood and make these insane war constructs out of them. They have a person who effectively wears a beehive as power armor. They're a really sick faction. I'm not sure if they're definitely on my radar for factions I would collect. I mean, they have that giant beetle guy, which I really like, and then of course all the tree people, and then you've got the guys that have the big swords and they're made of wood. Oh my god. Now, the Sylvaneth. Yeah, I'm gonna put the Sylvaneth in S tier. Sylvaneth are sick. I'm gonna put them above Stormcast. Sorry, Stormcast. But Sylvaneth are just so cool. They've got they're trees and insect themed, which isn't something we see very often. There are the Tyranids, but Tyranids are insect adjacent. They have more in common with mammals than they do with insects. And if you think about it, we kind of see it with Nurgle, but these guys really have their own flavor. Sylvaneth, they're very memorable. They look great on the tabletop. They take paint really well. They're super easy to make your own sort of custom look with them. And, well, I think sometimes the box art can be a little dull. I think it works out because the sort of ghost spirits that control a lot of these sort of tree constructs they're usually painted in these bright colors to contrast the earthen tones of the wood and everything. Overall, though, I mean, they're sick. If you don't like the Sylvaneth, I don't know what's wrong with you. They're literally insane ghost spirits that came from a different dimension to fight chaos. I'm a chaos fan, and that's sick. Anyways, I've been Spoons Rattling. I hope you enjoyed this video. I know that not quite as many of you like Age of Sigmar as 40k, which I'm in a similar boat. Though I think if you like 40k, give Sigmar a fair shake, and you'll probably enjoy it. There's a lot to like, rules-wise and in mini-wise. I hope you enjoyed this video. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and I will see you all next time.